Through the damp glass, Maria could see the silhouette of a woman, tall, but not yet fully formed in the shadows, approaching the door of apartment 13B, a door that had never opened in the 10 years Maria had lived across the hall. The sound of the lock turning, the door creaking open, Maria's heart skipped. The woman entered, and for a moment, Maria couldn't breathe, could hardly think. She had seen enough, but that wouldn't be enough. She knew it, as the world outside began to spin out of control. The next day, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something irreplaceable, something irretrievable. Her world felt suddenly smaller, like a room she had once felt comfortable in had begun to close in around her. The woman from last night, the one whose shadow had blurred into the darkness, haunted her every thought. Her memory clung to her like a damp coat. She told herself she was overreacting, but then there was the knock. A sharp rap at her door, one that didn't belong. "Maria, are you there?" The voice was unfamiliar, but somehow, it seemed to reach right into the pit of her stomach, tugging at her nerves. Maria opened the door to find a man standing there, a little taller than her, wearing a suit that seemed to be stitched from the very fabric of an old case file. His face was calm, almost too calm, his eyes sharp, like a blade just before it struck. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer a handshake. His next word struck her like a gunshot. "We need to talk about what you saw last night." Her world tilted, and the small, quiet life she'd built began to splinter. She had thought her silence would protect her, but the man standing in her doorway told a different story. He had seen her witness the rendezvous she couldn't unsee, and now she would have to make a choice, speak or disappear. Maria had always thought she could ignore the chaos of the world, that she could stay within the neat little boundaries she had created for herself. But as she stepped into the small cafe just off Main Street, the weight of the stranger's words lingered like smoke in her lungs. The doorbell chimed faintly behind her, and her gaze landed on a figure sitting in the far corner booth. He was the last person she expected to see. Daniel Gray. A name she hadn't thought about in years. Once, he'd been a close friend, a confidant, before he disappeared into a maze of problems she could never untangle. Now he was back, looking just as out of place as she felt, his eyes dark with something unspoken. Maria hesitated. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but her feet moved on their own, carried by an impulse she couldn't explain. She slid into the seat opposite him, the quiet hum of the cafe filling the empty space between them. "I didn't think you'd come," Daniel said, but the words felt like a warning. And in that moment, Maria knew that her life had irrevocably shifted. The truth she had been avoiding, the truth she had witnessed in the shadows, was now on the table. And whatever came next, it would change everything. Maria's apartment was quieter than ever. The city outside buzzed with its usual noise, sirens, shouting, the thrum of traffic, but inside, all she could hear was the muffled rhythm of her own pulse. The conversation with Daniel had left her unsettled, like a stone dropped in the middle of a calm pond, sending ripples she couldn't escape. She had tried to go about her life as usual, but the sense of unease followed her like a shadow. The man at her door, the one who had forced her into this mess, had left no room for doubt. Her silence would no longer be an option. And Daniel, with his cryptic warnings, had made it clear that things were already in motion, things she couldn't control. But what did any of it mean? What was the point of all the secrecy, the games? Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even when the apartment was empty. She had begun to notice the small things, the way the curtains were slightly drawn every morning, the way The door to her neighbor's apartment was always open a crack, as if someone was waiting for her to pass. She stared at the pile of papers on her desk, all of them connected to her research, her quiet, routine job at a local legal firm. But even the comforting hum of her work felt hollow. Her life, once simple and ordered, was now tangled in knots, and there was no untying them. The thrill of normalcy had faded, and now it was only the unbearable weight of what was coming. The quiet knock at the door that afternoon shattered the fragile peace. She already knew who it was before she even opened it. The man from the night before appeared in the same spot, just outside her door. His face was unreadable, cold, a mask of professionalism that felt wrong. But this time, he wasn't alone. Daniel stood beside him, his posture stiff, eyes avoiding Maria's gaze. The tension between the two men was palpable, as if a silent war had already begun between them. The space in the doorway felt too small, too cramped for the weight of their intentions. "We need you to help us," the man said, his voice crisp, commanding, but lacking warmth. "This is bigger than you think." Maria barely listened. Her mind was racing, already overwhelmed by the sudden pressure to choose a side. Daniel's presence only complicated matters. He wasn't the same man she had known. There was something different about him, something dangerous in his eyes. "I've been doing some digging," Daniel spoke up for the first time since the door had opened. "What you saw last night, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's more here than just one bad decision." Maria felt herself being pulled into something deeper, something darker than she had ever imagined. The stakes were rising, but so was the cost. It was impossible to turn back now. If she didn't help them, she'd be alone. If she did, she risked everything she had left. "I'll help," she said, before she had a chance to think it through. A flash of something, relief or calculation, passed between the men, and Maria knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that her life was no longer hers to control. The days bled together. Maria's routine had been shattered, and what followed felt like a slow descent into a world she wasn't prepared for. Every step she took felt heavy, laden with the consequences of her decision. The files she had agreed to look through, the information she was gathering, it was all beginning to weigh on her. And the more she learned, the more the threads of her former life unraveled. Daniel was always there, always just a little too close, a little too urgent. He became a fixture in her life, his presence both comforting and suffocating. It wasn't long before she realized she wasn't just helping him. She was being drawn deeper into his world, a world that was dangerous and full of people who could be trusted only as far as they could be controlled. The tension between the two men had escalated, their once tenuous alliance now strained, tested by their growing mistrust. The information Maria was finding wasn't just about one mysterious woman or one apartment. It was a thread that wound through every corner of the city, touching people, organizations, places she had never even heard of. And with every step forward, the cost grew higher. Her own safety was no longer guaranteed. Her job, her quiet life, none of it mattered. The stakes were personal now. Someone was watching her. Someone was always watching. It was late. The kind of late where everything seemed unreal, like the world outside had turned into a black and white photograph, the edges curling with time. Maria sat alone in the dim glow of her desk lamp, eyes bloodshot, the weight of days, weeks pressing down on her shoulders. She had always known something was off, but now the truth lay before her like an open wound. She had stumbled upon it by accident, like all the worst discoveries. A single name, repeated across the stack of files she had been sifting through. A name that had been buried beneath layers of deception and lies. The photograph was the key. A simple shot, two men, their faces half obscured by shadow, but one of them, the one who had seemed like an ally, stood out. It was the man who had knocked on her door, the one whose voice had sent a chill down her spine. But that wasn't the revelation. The revelation was the other man, in the photograph, standing beside him. His face was familiar too. Familiar. It was Daniel. Maria's pulse raced as the blood drained from her face. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't an isolated case. The man who had once been her friend, the man who had reached out to her for help, had known all along. Daniel wasn't just a victim. He was part of it. Part of the web that had ensnared her. The truth shattered everything she had believed about him, about herself. The man she had trusted, the one she had allowed into her life, had played a role in this from the beginning. The final piece clicked into place, and Maria understood, in that terrible, sinking way, that she had been manipulated from the start. And now there was no escape. The revelation hit harder than she could have imagined, but it wasn't enough to stop the gears of her world from grinding forward. Now, with the truth laid bare before her, Maria had a choice. The man in the photograph, Daniel, wasn't the only one whose loyalty she had to question. The man who had knocked on her door, he was the catalyst, the one who had set this chain of events into motion. His presence in her life, the pressure he applied, the promises he had made, all of it now seemed calculated, orchestrated. Daniel wasn't innocent, but neither was the man who had dragged her into this world of shadows. They both played their roles, and they had known exactly what they were doing. Maria's instincts screamed at her to run, to disappear, to erase herself from the entire situation. But she had seen too much, learned too much. There was no going back. The files were scattered in front of her like the pieces of a puzzle she had no choice but to complete. She could go to the authorities, expose what she had found, but that would put her at the mercy of the very men she had already realized were manipulating her. Or she could take matters into her own hands, confront the men who had played her, and possibly change everything. There was a price either way. A cost she wasn't sure she was ready to pay, and yet, as she stared at the photograph, she knew one thing for certain: the choice was hers now. And it would define her in ways she hadn't even begun to understand. Maria stood at the threshold, her pulse quickening, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest like a vice. She had made her choice, but she wasn't ready for the consequences. The man had called her earlier, his voice cold, as always, but there was something new in his tone. A hint of expectation. A sense that he knew she had come to a decision. That she was already in too deep to turn back. The room had grown darker, the shadows creeping along the walls, stretching toward her, as if the apartment itself was conspiring against her. The weight of the phone in her hand felt heavier now, as if the device had become a lifeline and a noose all at once. She didn't hesitate. The line rang 3 times before a voice picked up. The voice of the man who had set everything in motion. The voice of the person she would have to confront. "You're making a mistake," he said, his words calm but unmistakably cold. "But you've already come this far. There's no turning back now." And with those words, Maria knew the point of no return had been crossed. She had chosen her path, but she wasn't sure where it would lead. There was no going back. There was only forward. Into the dark. The night felt suffocating, a shroud that wrapped tightly around Maria's chest, pulling her into the silence of her apartment. The city outside continued its frantic dance, but inside, everything had come to a standstill. Time felt fragmented, broken into pieces she couldn't put back together. There was no more running, no more pretending. The confrontation was coming, she could feel it in the pit of her stomach. But for now, there was only the oppressive stillness. Daniel had disappeared for a few days, leaving Maria to her own thoughts. His absence felt like a temporary reprieve, but the tension in the air told her that it was only a matter of time before the storm broke. The phone had remained silent, the man from the other night oddly quiet. Maria wasn't sure if this lull was a blessing or a curse, but she knew she had no time to waste. She spent her nights combing through the files again, trying to make sense of everything she had learned. Each discovery brought more questions than answers. The deeper she dug, the darker the web became. What had started as a simple mystery had spiraled into something far more dangerous. Her reflection in the window caught her eye. It was a familiar sight, her face, pale and tired, the lines of worry etched deep beneath her eyes. She wondered, for the first time, if she would even recognize herself when this was over. What would be left of her when the truth finally came out? Would she even be the same person? The calm before the storm was suffocating, but it was also necessary. She knew that whatever happened next, she had no choice but to face it head on. There would be no more hiding. No more pretending. The storm was coming. The confrontation came without warning, as if the very air had been waiting to burst. Maria had barely finished her dinner when the knock came, a quick, sharp rapping on the door. She knew, instantly, that it was him. The man. The catalyst. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the tension in her chest wouldn't ease. She opened the door, and there he stood, dressed in the same dark suit, his expression as unreadable as ever. Behind him, Daniel lingered, his face more drawn than she had seen in days. He didn't look at her directly. His eyes were trained on the floor, as if the weight of what he had done was too much to bear. The man stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. "It's time," he said, his voice low, final. "We need to talk." Maria stepped aside, reluctantly inviting them in. The apartment felt smaller with both of them in it, the air thick with the gravity of the situation. There was no more pretending, no more games. The truth was out there, and now the three of them had to face it. "I've told you everything I know," Maria said, her voice steady but taut, with the tension in her body. "Now it's time for you to tell me everything." The man's gaze flickered to Daniel, and for the briefest of moments, Maria saw something pass between them, something cold and unspoken. Daniel had been more than just a pawn. He was a player in this twisted game, just as complicit as the man standing across from her. "Everything," Maria repeated, her voice rising, challenging. She could feel the walls closing in. "Or none of us walk away from this." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Maria had crossed the point of no return, and now there was only one way forward. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. What followed was a negotiation, not of words, but of power, the kind that could break people, destroy lives. The man spoke first, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "There are forces at play here that you don't fully understand, Maria. Forces you'll never fully escape." He paused, his gaze shifting to Daniel. "But there's still a way out." For all of us. Maria's heart raced, a torrent of emotions surging through her. The moment she had feared had arrived, and she wasn't sure she was prepared for it. The man's offer was simple: join them. Become part of the web. That had ensnared her from the beginning, become an insider, and secure her place in a world she had never asked for. But the price was steep. It wasn't just her freedom, it was everything she had believed in, everything she had stood for. To accept his offer would be to sell her soul, to destroy everything she had ever been. She turned to Daniel, her eyes searching his face for some sign, some hint of who he truly was. But he didn't meet her gaze. His silence spoke volumes. "I can't," she whispered, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest like a ton of bricks. The man's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Maria saw the mask slip. He wasn't just a figure in the shadows, he was a predator, and she was the prey. "I thought you might say that," he said, his voice colder than ever. "But know this, there's no way out now. You've already made your choice." And with that, the final act began. The silence that followed the confrontation was deafening, pressing down on Maria like a weight she couldn't escape. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The man's words echoed in her mind, cold and final. There was no way out. No escape from the web they had woven around her. Maria didn't know how long she stood there, her body frozen, her mind reeling from the gravity of the choice she had just made. She had refused him. Refused the life he offered, the life that would have tied her to a world of darkness and manipulation. But the cost was already clear. There was no freedom left for her. The truth she had uncovered had already set everything in motion, and now, the consequences were catching up to her. Daniel was gone. She had seen him leave, his figure disappearing into the night, the weight of his betrayal hanging between them like an insurmountable chasm. He had made his choice long before she had made hers. And now, he was gone. Maria felt the emptiness settle in, a hollow space where hope used to reside. There was no more fight left in her. What was left of her world had collapsed around her, leaving only ruins. The phone rang once, twice, then fell silent. The world outside had returned to its usual pace, the hum of the city. Nothing more than background noise to her shattered existence. The storm had passed, but the damage it had caused would linger forever. Weeks passed, and Maria adjusted to the new rhythm of her life. The world, as it always did, moved forward, indifferent to the storm she had weathered. But for Maria, nothing would ever be the same again. She found herself walking the same streets, returning to the same apartment, but everything felt different. The city around her, once vibrant and full of possibility, now felt cold, distant. The weight of the past pressed down on her every step. She had lost so much: her trust, her peace of mind, her understanding of who she was. But she was still here. Still breathing. Still alive. And for now, that was enough. Maria had learned to live with the consequences of her decisions, to accept the cost of her refusal. She would never be the same person she had been before. She had sacrificed her old life for a new one, one that was defined by the choices she had made in the darkness. But as she stood in front of the window one evening, watching the city come to life as the sun dipped below the horizon, she realized something. The past had tried to define her, to bind her to a narrative she couldn't control. But in the end, it was her choice, her will that had decided her fate. The new equilibrium was not one of peace. It was not one of redemption, but it was hers. And that, for now, was enough. The final echo of everything that had happened came not in the form of grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It came in the smallest of moments, a fleeting glance, a brief memory, a half-forgotten touch. As Maria walked through the streets one last time, a subtle shift in the air caught her attention. A flash of light from an alleyway. A sudden memory of a shadow. But this time, it was different. She didn't stop, she didn't turn, she just kept walking, as the world around her continued on. The recurring motif that had followed her through the entire ordeal, the fleeting shadows of the city, was now something she had learned to accept. It was not an enemy, not something to fight against. It was simply part of the rhythm of life, something that would forever linger in the background of her existence. Maria's story had come full circle, but it had left its mark on her in ways she hadn't fully understood. In the end, it wasn't the darkness she feared, it was the silence, the empty spaces between the moments that had shaped her. As the night closed in, Maria knew one thing: she was free. But freedom didn't mean a life without consequence. It meant choosing to live with the consequences, to accept them, and to move forward. And with that, Maria Marlowe stepped into the night, her steps echoing in the streets, a woman reborn in the silence after the storm.